Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. A prison cookout is a strange and beautiful lie. For one day, the 4th of July, the administration tries to pretend this ain't a cage. They roll out the big grills, the air fills with the smell of cheap hot dogs and barbecue smoke instead of disinfectant. They blast music over the loudspeakers. And for a few hours, men who ain't seen a blade of grass in a year get to feel the sun on their faces and pretend they're free. But it's a lie, because even with the music and the food, the walls are still there. The guards are still on the towers, rifles in hand, and the same beefs, the same hatreds that simmer in the cell blocks. They just move outside into the sunlight. Sometimes the sunlight makes them grow faster. This particular 4th of July was a hot one. The yard was packed, and the tension was thicker than the humidity. It was a city thing. Detroit versus Chicago, a classic prison beef, a rivalry that had been going on for decades, passed down from one generation of inmates to the next. On one side of the yard, you had the Detroit crew. They were run by an old-timer named Isaac. Isaac was a lifer, been inside since the 90s. He wasn't a violent man, not anymore. He was a politician. He understood that peace, even a fragile one, was good for business. It kept the guards calm, the privileges flowing. He and his crew, they were just trying to enjoy the day, to eat a hot dog, and for a few hours forget where they were. On the other side, you had the Chicago boys. They were run by a young, ambitious shot caller named Kane. Kane was the opposite of Isaac. He was all fire and fury. He saw the cookout not as a day of peace, but as a stage, a chance to show the whole yard who was really in charge. His crew was loud, full of a restless, aggressive energy. The two crews occupied opposite ends of the yard, of two opposing armies on a temporary ceasefire. But you could feel the tension in the air, a sideways glance, a muttered insult, small things, but in here, there are no small things. Everything is a test. Everything is a message. I was sitting with some of the old heads, watching the whole thing unfold. We'd seen this movie before. A holiday, a little bit of freedom, a lot of pride. It was a recipe for disaster. The trouble started, as it always does, over something stupid. The basketball court. The Chicago boys had been holding it down all afternoon, running loud, aggressive games. One of the young kids from the Detroit crew, a new fish named Twan, wanted to get in on a game, and he walked over, asked to run next. Kane's right-hand man just looked at him and laughed. "This ain't Detroit, little man," he said. "We don't play with trash here." The insult was loud, public. Twan, young and full of a foolish pride, puffed out his chest. "Say that again." And just like that, the first spark was lit. It didn't come to blows, not yet. Some of the old heads stepped in, pulled Twan away, but the damage was done. A line had been crossed, a public disrespect had been issued, and in the brutal, unforgiving world of the prison yard, there was a debt that had to be paid. The beautiful lie of the prison cookout was about to come to a bloody and tragic end. The basketball court incident was a stone dropped in a steel pond. The ripples spread fast. Word of the disrespect to Twan, and by extension to all of Detroit, moved through the yard like a current. The fragile piece of the cookout was shattered. The air grew thick with a new and dangerous electricity. Isaac, the old head from Detroit, heard the news and his face went grim. He knew what this meant. This wasn't about a basketball game anymore. This was about honor, about reputation. If he let this slide, he would look weak. And in here, weakness is a death sentence. He called his lieutenants together by the handball court. They were all young, hot-headed, ready for war. "We got to answer back, Ike," one of them said. "We can't let them Chicago boys punk us in front of the whole yard." Isaac held up a hand. He was a strategist, not a brawler. He knew that a full-blown riot would be bad for everyone. It would mean a long, brutal lockdown, a loss of all the small privileges that made this life bearable. "We'll handle it," he said, his voice a low, steady calm. "But not here. Not now. We do this smart. Not loud. He was trying to contain the fire, to control the narrative. But the fire was already spreading too fast. On the other side of the yard, Cain was holding his own court. He was basking in the glory of the confrontation. His crew was hyped up, their chests puffed out. They had drawn a line in the sand, and the Detroit crew hadn't crossed it. In their minds, they had won. But Cain was smart enough to know it wasn't over. He knew Isaac. He knew the old man was a snake, quiet but deadly. He told his own men to stay sharp, to be ready. The cookout was no longer a celebration. It was a staging ground. The guards felt it too. They started to move through the yard in pairs, their hands resting on their batons. The warden came out, stood on the tower, surveying the scene with a worried look on his face. He knew the signs. He knew how quickly a day like this could turn into a nightmare. The two crews were now two separate hostile nations, occupying the same small piece of land. They ate at different tables, they used different bathrooms, they created an invisible and deadly border in the middle of the yard. The other inmates, the civilians, they knew what was coming. They started to drift back to their cell blocks, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. The yard, which had been a loud, chaotic scene of celebration just an hour ago, was now eerily quiet, filled with a tense and simmering silence, and it was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And in a place like this, a place filled with so much anger, so much pride, so much pain, the spark is never far away. The spark came, as it often does, from a place of pure, stupid pride. Twan, the young kid from Detroit who had been at the center of the first incident, couldn't let it go. The humiliation was a fire in his gut. He felt like he had to prove himself to his crew and to himself. He saw one of Cain's lieutenants, a dude named Blade, walking by himself near the weight pit. And in a moment of reckless and ultimately fatal foolishness, Twan decided to make a statement. He walked up to Blade, got in his face. "You Chicago boys all talk," he said, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. Blade just looked at him, a slow, cold smile on his face. "You sure you want to do this, little man?" And then Twan did the unthinkable. He swung. It was a clumsy telegraph punch. Blade dodged it easily, and in one fluid motion, he pulled a shank, a sharpened piece of metal, from his waistband. The sun glinted off the steel. The yard went silent, and then the chaos erupted. Blade lunged, and the shank found a home in Twan's side. Twan crumpled to the ground, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and then the world exploded. The Detroit crew saw their man go down, and they charged. A wave of orange-clad bodies, their faces masked of pure, murderous rage. The Chicago crew met them in the middle of the yard, and the Prison Cookout became a full-blown riot. It was a scene of pure medieval brutality. Men fought with fists, with feet, with shanks, with anything they could get their hands on. The ground, which had been a field of green grass just moments ago, was now a canvas of blood and mud. Isaac, the old head from Detroit, saw the riot explode and his heart sank. He had tried to control it, to keep it from getting to this. But the pride of the young bucks was a force of nature, a wildfire that could not be contained. He knew he had a choice. He could stand back, let his men fight and die. Or he could be the general he was supposed to be. He grabbed a weight from the dumbbell rack and he charged into the fray. Cain on the other side was in his element. This was what he had wanted, a war, a chance to prove his dominance, to cement his legacy as the baddest man on the yard. He fought with a cold, vicious efficiency, his shank a blur of deadly motion. The guards were overwhelmed. They blew their whistles, fired tear gas into the crowd, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. The riot raged on, a symphony of violence and chaos, the smoke from the barbecue grills mixing with the tear gas, a strange, surreal smell of a holiday gone to hell. The beautiful lie was over, and the brutal, bloody truth of prison life had reasserted itself with a vengeance. The riot was a blur of motion and sound, a chaotic, swirling vortex of violence, but in the middle of that storm, there were small and brutal moments of clarity. Isaac, the old head from Detroit, fought with a cold and weary fury. He wasn't a young man anymore, but the years of survival had made him a dangerous opponent. He saw Kane, the young buck from Chicago, carving a path through the crowd, his eyes burning with a wild and joyous fire. And in that moment, Isaac knew this war would not end until one of them was on the ground. He moved toward Kane, the weight in his hand a heavy and final piece of punctuation. Their eyes met across the yard. And in that one silent look, the two leaders, the two kings, began their own private and deadly dance. Meanwhile, the guards had sounded the main alarm. Reinforcements were pouring into the yard, a riot squad in full gear, their shields and batons a hard black line against the chaos. They fired rubber bullets into the crowd, the impact a series of dull, sickening thuds. The riot started to break apart, the inmates scattering and trying to disappear back into the anonymity of the crowd. But for Isaac and Kane, the war was not over. They were locked in their own personal battle, a struggle for dominance, for survival. Kane was younger, faster. But Isaac was smarter, more experienced. He used the chaos of the yard to his advantage, dodging, weaving, waiting for his opening. He saw it, a split second of imbalance as Kane lunged, and he brought the weight down, hard on Kane's shoulder. A sickening crack echoed in the air. Kane screamed a raw animal sound of pain, and then he went down. The king of Chicago was on his knees. Isaac stood over him, the weight raised, ready for the final blow. And in that moment, as he looked down at the young broken man at his feet, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own past. The same anger, the same pride, the same foolish and deadly ambition, and something inside him shifted. He didn't bring the weight down. He just let it fall from his hand. He was done. Done with the violence, the beefs, the endless and pointless cycle of retribution. He turned and walked away, leaving Kane on the ground, a fallen king in a kingdom of cages. The guards swarmed them, both the batons rising and falling. The riot was over. The yard was a scene of carnage. Broken bodies, pools of blood, the lingering smell of tear gas, the beautiful lie of the prison cookout had been replaced by the brutal and undeniable truth. There are no holidays in hell. The aftermath of the riot was a cold and brutal reckoning. The prison was on lockdown for 3 months, 24 hours a day in a cell, no yard time, no visits, no phone calls, just the four walls of your cage and the ghosts of what had happened on that bloody, sun-drenched afternoon. The infirmary was overflowing with the wounded, and Twan, the young kid from Detroit, whose foolish pride had started it all, he didn't make it. He had bled out on the yard before the medics could get to him. He was just another casualty of a war that had no meaning. Dozens of other inmates were seriously injured. And Kane, the king of Chicago, he would never be the same. His shoulder was shattered. His fighting days were over. He had lost his crown, his power, his reputation, all in one single and devastating moment of defeat. Isaac, the old head from Detroit, he was in the hole, facing a new set of charges for his role in the riot. But he had a strange sense of peace. He had ended the war on his own terms. He had chosen mercy over murder. And in that one small and courageous act, he had reclaimed a piece of his own soul. The prison administration came down hard. They identified the leaders, the main instigators. Isaac, Kane, and a dozen other men were transferred to a supermax facility, a prison within a prison, a place from which there is no escape. The two crews, the serpents and the kings, were broken, scattered. The old power structures were gone, and a new and more chaotic era of prison politics began. And this story, the story of the prison cookout, it became a legend in the yard, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, about the stupidity of a war where the only thing you're fighting for is a bigger piece of a cage. It's a reminder that in a place like this, a place that is designed to strip you of your humanity, the hardest and most important fight is not against the man from a different city or the man with a different color on his back. It's against the monster inside yourself. The monster that tells you that violence is strength, that pride is more important than peace. Isaac in the end won that fight. Cain lost it. And the rest of the men on that yard, they were just caught in the crossfire, casualties of a war that had no winners, only ghosts. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.